When most people picture a farm running out of water, they picture a bad season, a dry summer, a shriveled crop, a hard year. And then in their mind, the rains return, the reservoirs refill, and the farm goes back to normal the way it always has. That picture is comforting. It is also, in the places that matter most, dangerously wrong. Because there is a kind of water loss that a farm does not recover from. Not next year, not in 10 years, not in the lifetime of anyone farming that land, or their children, or their grandchildren. When a farm crosses a certain line, the damage is not to the crop. It is to the ground itself, to the hidden reservoir beneath the field that took thousands of years to fill, and once that is gone, it is gone in a way that no wet winter can fix. And here's the part almost no one understands. The reason it never comes back is not just that the water is used up. It is that the act of pulling that water out destroys the very thing that held it. The land collapses in on the empty space. The underground vault seals itself shut forever. So even if the rains came back tomorrow, in full there would be nowhere left underground to put them. So the real question is not whether a farm can survive a dry year. Farms survive dry years all the time. The question is what happens the moment a farm crosses the line into the kind of thirst that has no return, and what that means for the fields, the towns around them, and the food on every table in the country. Let me take you to the day it happens, because it does not look like a disaster. It looks like a normal morning. A farmer walks out to a well he has trusted his whole life. It is one of the wells that irrigates his fields sunk deep into the ground years ago, and it is always delivered. He starts the pump the way he has 10,000 times. And this time, the sound is wrong. Instead of the steady rush of water, there is a cough, a sputter, a rattle of the pump pulling at air and sand. The water level in the aquifer below him has dropped beneath the bottom of his well. Not low, below it. The straw is no longer reaching the drink. He has options, and he knows them, and none of them are good. He can pay to drill deeper, chasing the falling water table down into the earth, a race that costs a fortune and that he can only win for so long. He can switch to crops that need less water and earn less money, or he can watch his fields go brown. But standing there, listening to his pump choke on nothing, he understands the thing that the comforting picture leaves out. The water under his land did not run low this year. It has been running out for decades, and he is simply the one standing there on the morning the account finally went overdrawn. And drilling deeper, the option that sounds like a solution, is really just a faster way to lose. Sinking a new well hundreds of feet down into the earth costs a small fortune, tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars, money that many farmers only have if they borrow it. So they take on debt to chase the water lower, and for a while it works, and the pumps run again. But every farmer over that same aquifer is doing the same thing, and every new deep well pulls the shared water table down further, which means the well you just went into debt to drill starts failing sooner than the last one did. It is an arms race with a floor. Each round costs more and buys less time, and the only guaranteed outcome is that the deepest pockets pump the longest while everyone else drops out along the way. You are not solving the shortage by drilling deeper. You are borrowing against a future that is arriving faster because you drilled. To understand why this is permanent, you have to understand where a farm's water actually comes from, because most of the food you eat is not grown on rain. Farming uses the overwhelming majority of the water people pull from the environment, far more than all the cities and all the homes combined. And in the great agricultural regions that feed this country, that water comes from two places. The first is surface water, the rivers and the canals and the reservoirs, the allotments delivered to farms through vast networks of infrastructure. But surface water is the first thing cut in a drought. When the rivers run short and the reservoirs drop, the deliveries to farms get slashed, sometimes to nothing. And when that happens, farms turn to the second source, the one beneath their feet. Groundwater, the water held in the aquifers below the fields reached by drilling wells and pumping it up. For a farm, groundwater is the savings account, the emergency reserve you draw on when the rivers fail. In a normal system, you pump it in the dry years and let it refill in the wet ones. But across the most productive farmland in America, the dry years stopped taking turns with the wet ones. The rivers deliver less and less, so the pumps run harder and harder, year after year, and the savings account is being emptied far faster than anything can ever refill it. The farm is not living on its income anymore. It is living on its principal, and principal, once spent, is gone. Now here is the mechanism that makes it truly irreversible, and it is the part that turns a shortage into a permanent wound. An aquifer is not an underground lake, an open cavern full of water. It is far stranger than that. It is a body of sediment, layers of sand and gravel and clay, and the water is held in the tiny spaces between all those particles, like water soaked into a sponge. When the aquifer is full, the water in those spaces actually helps hold the whole structure up, propping the grains apart, bearing part of the weight of everything above. The water is not just sitting in the ground. It is part of the skeleton of the ground. Pull that water out, and you take away the support. In the sandy layers, the grains can still rest against each other and the space mostly survives, so if water ever returned, there would be room for it. But the fine-grained clay layers are different. When the water pressure drops and the water drains out of the clay, those layers compact. They collapse down onto themselves, the tiny pore spaces crushing flat under the weight of all the earth above, and they do not spring back. That compaction is permanent. The space that once held water is simply gone, squeezed out of existence. And because that space is gone, the aquifer's ability to ever store that much water again is gone with it. You have not just emptied the tank, you have crushed the tank. And that collapse does not stay hidden underground. It shows up on the surface as one of the eeriest signs of this whole crisis. The land sinks. As the layers compact far below, the ground above them settles downward, slowly, silently, sometimes by inches a year, sometimes by feet over decades. Entire valleys are dropping. In the hardest hit farm country, the surface of the earth has fallen by tens of feet over the last century, whole landscapes quietly deflating like a slow leak as the water is drawn out from beneath them. The sinking cracks roads and buildings. It ruptures the very canals that were built to deliver surface water, so that the infrastructure meant to save the farms is broken by the same overpumping that is dooming them. The land is not just going dry, it is going down, and it is not coming back up. Nowhere is the scale of this clearer than under the Great Plains, where the largest aquifer of its kind sits beneath the breadbasket of America. Stretched under parts of 8 states lies an enormous underground reserve of fresh water that made the dry heart of the country bloom. For generations, farmers have pumped it to grow the corn and the wheat and to water the cattle that feed a huge share of the nation. It looked, for a while, like an inexhaustible gift, but much of that water is ancient, laid down over an immense span of time, and in large areas it barely refills at all from today's rainfall. And the pumping has been relentless. In stretches of that region, so much has already been withdrawn that the wells that used to strike water shallow now have to reach down hundreds of feet, and in some places they have run dry entirely. When that happens, a farmer who has grown thirsty, high-value crops on that water for his whole life is forced back to dryland farming, growing only what the sparse rain will support on a fraction of the income. Fields that were green squares of irrigated crops visible from space revert to dry, pale scrub. And the truly sobering part is the timeline. In some of the most heavily pumped areas, the remaining usable water is measured not in centuries, but in years or a few decades. An entire agricultural civilization, built in a single century on water that took far longer than that to accumulate, is drawing down its foundation toward a bottom that people now alive will live to see. Out west, in the valleys of California, the same story is written even more dramatically into the land itself. California's Central Valley is one of the most productive agricultural regions on the entire planet, a place that grows an astonishing share of the country's fruits, nuts, and vegetables. And it runs on a combination of surface water carried down from the mountains and groundwater pumped from below. In the deep droughts, when the surface deliveries were cut, the valley leaned on its wells like never before, drilling deeper and pumping harder to keep the orchards alive, and the ground responded exactly as the physics demands. It sank. Parts of the valley floor have dropped so much over the decades that it counts among the largest human-caused elevation changes anywhere on Earth. And in the worst recent years, the land in places has been falling by close to a foot annually. The state finally passed a law to force groundwater use back towards something sustainable. And the arithmetic of that law is brutal. To bring the pumping into balance, a staggering amount of farmland, potentially hundreds of thousands of acres, will have to be permanently taken out of production. Not rested, retired. Because the water to support it does not exist, and the ground that stored the backup has already begun to collapse. And what makes the modern version of this so much more dangerous is what these farms chose to grow. Over the last few decades, huge areas of the most productive farmland shifted away from crops you plant fresh each year, like tomatoes or cotton, and into permanent crops, orchards of almonds and pistachios, vineyards, groves of citrus, trees, and vines that take years and a great deal of money to establish before they ever produce, and that then live and bear fruit for decades. On paper, they were the most profitable thing a farmer could plant. But a permanent crop comes with a permanent demand. You cannot fallow an orchard for a hard year the way you can leave a field of vegetables unplanted. A tree that goes without water does not pause. It dies, and with it dies the 15 or 20 years of investment standing in the ground. That is the trap that has been laid across millions of acres. Farmers planted trees that must be watered every single year, no matter what, in regions where the water supply has become anything but guaranteed. So when the surface deliveries get cut, there is no option to simply skip a season. The trees demand their water, and the only place left to get it is the ground, which means the drought years, the exact years the aquifer most needs a rest, are the years it gets pumped the hardest to keep the orchards alive. The crops that made the land richest also made it least able to survive the thing that is now coming for it. And when the water finally runs out for good, it is not a bare field that dies. It is an entire living orchard, and everything sunk into it all at once. So the moment arrives, the well coughs, the account is overdrawn, and the water does not come back. What happens next is not one event. It is a cascade, and the first thing to fall is not the farm. It is the people who live around it. Because when the big agricultural wells drill deeper to chase the falling water, they lower the water table for everyone. And the shallowest wells, the ones that go dry first, are almost never the deep, expensive irrigation wells of the large operations. They are the modest household wells of the small towns and the farm worker communities scattered across that same farmland. These are families who turn on their kitchen tap one day and get nothing but air because the water table has dropped below their home well while the big pumps nearby keep running. This has already happened to thousands of households in the farm towns of the very regions we are talking about. Whole communities left without running water in their homes, in the richest agricultural country in the world, forced to rely on bottled water and emergency tanks in the yard just to cook and bathe and flush. The farm running out of water does not start by drying up the crops. It starts by drying up the kitchen sinks of the people who work the land. Then the fields themselves begin to go, and the economy built on them goes with them. A field with no water is a field with no crop, and a field with no crop is fallowed, left bare. When it is one field, it is one farmer's hardship. But when the water crisis forces hundreds of thousands of acres out of production across a region, it becomes something else. The farm jobs vanish, the planting and the tending and the harvest work that entire towns depend on. The businesses that serve the farms, the equipment dealers, the truckers, the packing houses, the small stores on the main streets, lose the ground under their feet. The tax base that funds the schools and the roads shrinks. Land that was worth a fortune as productive orchard becomes worth a fraction as dust. And people begin to leave because there is nothing to stay for, and a farm town without farming slowly hollows out into empty storefronts and for sale signs and a population of the old and the stuck. The water leaving the ground pulls the life out of the community above it, the same way it pulls the support out of the aquifer below. And as the small and mid-sized farms fall, something quieter and more permanent happens to who controls the land and the water that is left. A drought does not empty every field at the same rate. The operations with the deepest pockets, the large corporate farms, and the investors who have moved into agriculture are the ones who can afford to drill the deepest wells, absorb the losses of a bad year, and keep pumping when their smaller neighbors cannot. So when a family farm finally goes dry and the owner is forced to sell, the buyer is very often one of those larger players, picking up the land and crucially the water rights that come with it, at a discount. Piece by piece, the collapse of the aquifer becomes a transfer of ownership, concentrating the most basic engine of the food supply into fewer and fewer hands. Water, in these regions, has quietly become a tradable asset, something that can be bought, sold, and speculated on, and scarcity only makes it more valuable to the people positioned to hold it. So the same shortage that ruins the family farmer enriches the entity that can outlast him. The land does not stop being farmed all at once. It changes hands. And the people who end up holding it are the ones for whom a crisis is not a catastrophe, but an opportunity. And the land that is left behind, the acres that no one can keep in production at all, does not simply wait patiently to be farmed again someday. It changes, often for the worse. Bare, abandoned fields in a dry climate are the raw material of dust. The soil that is no longer held together by roots and moisture lifts into the wind, and a region that overpumps itself dry can find its own topsoil, the priceless living layer that took thousands of years to build, blowing away across the landscape. This is not a hypothetical. The most famous ecological catastrophe in American history, the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, was born from exactly this collision of drought and stripped exposed farmland, when the soil rose into black blizzards that buried homes and drove families off the land in the hundreds of thousands. And there is another quiet killer in the soil. As irrigation water is applied and evaporates year after year, and as farmers pump increasingly salty deep groundwater, salts build up in the earth. The ground grows steadily more toxic to crops, until land that was once richly productive can no longer grow much of anything at all. Between the dust that carries the soil away and the salt that poisons what remains, a farm that runs dry does not stay a farm in waiting. It becomes something closer to a wasteland, and reversing that, if it can be reversed at all, is the work of generations. And this is the point where it stops being someone else's problem in a distant valley and becomes everyone's problem, because these are the places that grow the food. The regions where this is happening are not marginal farmland. They are the agricultural heartlands that supply a huge portion of what the entire country eats, and beyond it, what much of the world eats. When hundreds of thousands of acres come out of production, when the great aquifers that irrigate the breadbasket run down, the effect does not stay on the farm. It moves up the chain to the grocery store, in the form of less supply, higher prices, and a food system quietly losing some of its most productive ground at the exact moment there are more mouths than ever to feed. The person who never sets foot on a farm still eats 3 times a day, and every one of those meals is underwritten by water being pumped out of the ground somewhere faster than it will ever return. We have been buying cheap, abundant food, in part by spending down an irreplaceable savings account of underground water, and the bill for that does not land on the farmer alone. It lands on everyone who eats, and it does not stop at price. A country that lets its most productive farmland go dry becomes a country that has to buy more of its food from somewhere else, handing away a piece of the most basic security there is, the ability to feed yourself, in exchange for dependence on farms and aquifers on the other side of the world that are often running down just as fast. The water under a field in Kansas or California is not just a local resource. It is a strategic one, quietly underwriting the stability of the whole nation's food supply. And we have been drawing it down as if it would never end, treating the deepest foundation of the country's security as though it were free and infinite, and ours to spend without ever having to notice it was gone. And at this point, people always ask the obvious question: why not just bring in more water, build a pipeline, a canal, a desalination plant, and refill what was lost? The scale is what defeats every version of that idea. Farming does not use a little water. It uses more than everything else combined. Oceans of it, applied across millions of acres. Desalination, turning seawater into fresh, is expensive enough that it can make sense for a coastal city's drinking supply. But the numbers collapse completely when you try to irrigate a thirsty crop with it hundreds of miles inland and uphill. Moving surface water from somewhere wetter runs into the fact that the wetter places increasingly need their own, and that the canals built to carry water long distances are themselves being wrecked by the very subsidence this crisis creates. As the land sinks unevenly, it warps the great aqueducts, robbing them of the gentle downhill slope they need to flow and permanently cutting how much water they can deliver, so the region loses carrying capacity at the same moment it needs more. There is no spare ocean of cheap, fresh water sitting nearby waiting to be plugged in. The water that built these farms was a one-time inheritance stored in the ground over geologic time, and nothing we can build refills that account at the price and the scale that farming requires. So why, knowing all of this, does it keep happening? Why does everyone keep pumping? The answer is one of the oldest traps there is. An aquifer under a farming region is usually shared by everyone who sits above it, and the water belongs, in effect, to whoever pumps it first. So each farmer faces a merciless logic. The water you leave in the ground to be responsible does not stay there waiting for you. Your neighbor's well can pull it out from under your land just as easily as you can. So the incentive, for everyone, is to pump as much as possible as fast as possible, before someone else does. Restraint only works if everyone does it together. And without a strong rule forcing that, the rational choice for each individual is to keep racing to the bottom of the well. Everyone can see the shared reservoir dropping. Everyone knows where it ends. And still the pumps run, because the first person to slow down is simply the first person to lose. It is a race that everyone loses in the end, run at full speed precisely because no one can afford to be the one who stops. The farmer stood by his coughing well that morning, and by the afternoon the pump was silent and the story moved on the way these stories do. A wetter year came, and the rivers ran a little fuller, and the surface deliveries returned for a season, and everyone told themselves the worst was behind them. But the water table under his fields did not rise back to where it was. The clay beneath him, once collapsed, stayed collapsed, holding a little less water forever. The land sat a few inches lower than it had the year before. The town down the road had a few more empty houses, and somewhere out across that valley, another pump was reaching a little deeper into the ground, chasing the same falling water toward the same silent morning, on land that had already begun, quietly and permanently, to sink beneath the weight of everything it could no longer hold.